What's up, video editors and some of you gamers out there? I want to talk to you today about the Mantiz Venus eGPU enclosure that's actually housing the Sapphire Vega 64, as you can see. And yes, this is a blower style card. I will talk about some of the hiccups with this card, who I think that this is actually really good for, who it may not necessarily be a good investment for right now. I will briefly touch on some of the gaming aspects, but more importantly, I will go into the video stuff. But I will also want to preface to you that everything happened in Mac OS. I didn't run any boot camp, no Windows, nothing like that. So nothing like underclocked, overclocked, undervolted, or anything where you can use those apps in Windows to adjust this card. I wanted it to work natively in Mac OS, which it definitely did. I also want to talk about an upgrade that I had to make to this card, or at least that I thought I had to make to this card, and give you as much detail as I possibly can. Let me preface though, this may be very lengthy, but I just want to answer as many questions as possible. I will brief over the gaming stuff. I'll start with that first in a second, and then I will talk about the video editing aspects. And so whether you're a YouTuber, professional filmmaker, you get paid for photography or filmmaking or something like that, where you're working with these very large files, just like myself, time is currency, people. Time is money. And when you're dealing with budgets and projects and time, and you need your output and your deliverables to happen faster, an eGPU, depending on what you're working on, may be the way to go. And like I said, I will go into as many details as I can. Now, first off, let me just talk about my particular setup. I am rocking a 2017 base model 13-inch MacBook Pro. So that is a Core i5 with an Intel Iris Graphics 640 that's integrated, and it does have 16 gigs of RAM. Now, many of you might be asking, if you're doing video, why in the world are you using something like that? Well, this is just something that I had been using for another job, or I do use for other work, and I just like the smaller footprint, and I just wanted the portability. However, I will say, like, without an eGPU or anything like that, before this thing, I was doing fine with 4K footage, doing color correction, LUTs, and retiming and working and scrubbing through that timeline with no issues, no drop frames. It works just fine out of the box with 4K footage. Now, with Apple announcing the Blackmagic eGPU, that thing's retailing at $1,300 compared to something like this, which is roughly about half the price. And I'll get into some of that, but the case itself is about $329. You can grab that on Amazon. And the card right now can be purchased from anywhere from $350 to $400 at this point. And so you're already looking at roughly half the cost. And this thing is upgradable. I have modded this thing, I've done something to it, and it also is really a docking station because it's got the 2 USB 3.0 ports on the front, and I've also got 3 on the back with 1 Thunderbolt 3 port on that for the computer itself in Mojave. So I do have 10.14.1. Natively, this thing, there's no scripts, there's nothing you have to do with it. You literally just, you plug the box in, you turn the power supply on, but when you turn the power supply on, just be mindful that you have to plug it into the computer before it will turn on. So if you're turning it on and you're freaking out like this thing isn't powering up, you have to use the cable that comes with it. And yes, it is very short, but once you plug it into the MacBook Pro, everything fires up, it's recognized, and you can find it in the taskbar in the top. And you can also go into About This Mac and find that the graphics card is there. I didn't have to type anything or customize anything, like it recognized it right away. Also, for all of you out there, whether you're using Adobe, Illustrator, Final Cut Pro, anything that can use an external graphics card in Mac OS, once this thing is plugged in, what you do is you go to your applications folder, right click on that application, and then check the box that says preferred eGPU. Now, it has to be plugged in for you to do that, but once you set those settings will remain. Now, let's actually talk about some of the benchmarks and some of the OpenCL stuff, and I'll also get into a few of the hiccups. I'll talk about what I've had to mod on this thing and why. Now, let's actually get into that first. Let's actually talk about that as far as like the mods concerned. So I do have to give Mantiz, the team over there, credit, because I did reach out to them, because these Vega 64 cards are power hungry. You can see that everywhere. And even on the box, this thing is asking for a 750 watt PSU in it. Now, of course, that's in a PC tower that's powering other things. However, the Mantiz Venus hooked up to a MacBook Pro allocates 87 watts to charge the MacBook Pro. So you're already pulling some of that off of that PSU. And again, when a card is power hungry and you're also pulling power to charge a computer, your mileage may vary, and mine actually was very interesting. So some of my early benchmarks, and I won't talk about the raw numbers just yet because I don't think those were like the real numbers, but when I was using iStat and just that's what I was using in Mac OS to see what the pull was as far as the clock speed and what was going on with like the boost clock on the Vega 64 with the PSU, the 550 watt, and they say it's the gold. It powered up, there was no issues, but when I was running these benchmark tests, I was noticing that the clock speed, like the boost on it, like it was only getting like 800 megahertz. And I know that that's capable like twice that. So I was a little like trying to figure something out. So like I said, reaching out to Mantiz, they said, yes, it supports the Vega 64, even though it doesn't say that on the website. I also saw a video 9 to 5 Mac that had this thing hooked up to the exact MacBook Pro, and I was like, it seemed to work for them, and that's really what kind of started it for me. However, when I decided to order a Silverstone 650 watt PSU based off of a user over at eGPU.io, I'm going to link up all of these resources and some other YouTubers that you may find helpful information from, just like I did. But I will say that he decided to add the 650 watt PSU, and he said that his Vega 64 card had much better like use, like as far as like the clock and it using pretty much everything that it was capable of when he was gaming on his MacBook Pro. So the Silverstone is the exact same, the 650 watt PSU that is the exact same as far as like the size is concerned. I will tell you though, when you need to install it, everything is easily like accessed because this whole door comes off. But what I recommend is actually removing the screws from the back, pulling this whole thing out and removing the PSU that way. So, you know, try not to kind of like work around in there because you can kind of just, you know, jack up the motherboard and some other components in there. And so like you don't want to do that. Putting that one in, it went very easily, and I connected the graphics card easily, and everything seemed to be fine. And when I started running the benchmarks, I noticed all of a sudden that 700, 800 megahertz was going up to like 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and then 1.5. Like it just kept going up. So I don't know if that's just an anomaly, if that's something that like it was like a fluke thing, because many of you might be saying like, well, it just wouldn't power up. Like if it was underpowered, it just wouldn't power up. However, I was getting more output from that card once I upgraded the PSU. And for me, the 650 watt is enough, both from a gaming standpoint and from video editing. All right, so for the gamers out there, let me preface, again, no boot camp, no Windows. I'm not a gamer. I did some benchmarks with Unigine Heaven, and I also played Fortnite. Now, some of you might be laughing at me, but I did everything like unlimited, extreme, like no limitations, and I did have a hiccup. I'll talk about that in a second. But let's actually talk about the benchmark that we got in Unigine Heaven. And I'll also compare that to the 15-inch MacBook Pro Core i9 with the Vega 20 that just came out. And Max Yuriev, and I'll link his video up, he just launched that video and also ran those benchmarks, and this was interesting. So in my Unigine Heaven benchmark, I ran everything at extreme, ultra, or whatever it was, like I maxed everything out. And my results, I thought, were pretty astounding. So I was actually getting 64 frames per second and a score of 1,612. Now, let me actually walk back here and let you know that one of the questions may be, can you just power up the internal display on the MacBook Pro and you're good to go? Yeah, that's fine. The card itself has one HDMI and 3 display ports coming off of it. Now, I did hook up an external display to it, and I do recommend that depending on what you're doing. And I will also link up some resources to let you know that that 40 gigabits per second that's happening in that Type-C, that Thunderbolt 3, that's not everything that you're getting when you're going back and forth. Running these benchmarks, like there's not a lot of communication happening there, and so the raw benchmarks, like those numbers, can be a little bit off compared to your actual use case. When you hook up an external monitor, or let's say that it's just the internal display, you're going to be sacrificing about 20% of the performance of what this eGPU can do. So that 40 gigabits per second is going to drop down to about 32 gigabits per second. So just keep that in mind. It's not necessarily a must, but it does help especially like if, again, time is currency, time is money, and you need that output. And so the external display, I would recommend it if you have something like that or something that you need to invest in down the road, but I would make that investment because it definitely helped. Now let's actually compare that to the 15-inch Core i9 Vega 20 that Max Yuriev did. So he got some interesting numbers just right out of the gates. So with Heaven, he got 38.4 on the frames per second. And as far as the score was concerned, he got 967 on that score. So that Vega 20 is definitely very efficient, and he was definitely getting, I think it was somewhere like 30 to 40% improvement, I think. Don't quote me on that. Like I said, I'll link up his video. Now, the OpenCL for the 15-inch Core i9 Vega 20, he was actually getting around 71,937 on the Geekbench 4 OpenCL. Now, compare that to what my results were on Geekbench 4. I did the Iris graphics, so the integrated graphics, the Iris 640. I got 31,122, and that's on the internal graphics. However, on the eGPU, I got 139,880 on OpenCL. And for Metal, I got 150,815 on the eGPU. Almost like twice as much as far as the benchmarks. But again, these are benchmarks. Let's flip over to the gaming stuff and talk about the game itself. So not being a gamer, not playing anything like Crysis or Grand Theft Auto or anything that may like really push this thing. I played Fortnite, but I opened everything up. I let it all go, like unlimited frame rate, whatever I could do to let this thing like play out at its max. It was going great. Like I wasn't dropping any frames. You know, I'm playing with my kids and like everything was going fine. Now, here's the one caveat that I need to bring to your attention. If you're using this blower card and you have this eGPU and you see this clear plastic that's on here, well, literally, like when that door is open, it's covering up that blower. Well, the thing is like there's a fan underneath here, and this is actually trying to do some exchange here, and then also out of the PSU. But the problem is like that being in front of the blower, this thing is like a heater. So after playing it for an hour on unlimited everything, it just cut. Like it literally cut out, like it stopped working. So I freaked initially, of course, pulled everything out, pulled the door off, pulled everything out. Nothing seemed to be fried. I pulled the card out, laid it out on the desk for about 8-10 minutes, and then popped it back in, and it fired right up, no problem. Now what I did was I did take this door off and I went back to gaming again, and I was finding like it was fine, but this is really, really quiet. As you can see, it's on right now and it's very quiet. But when I was gaming, this thing, the blower, like the motor definitely fires up, so you can hear it. So if that's annoying to you, that may be a problem, but otherwise like it was fine. It at least handled what I was throwing at it per that game in Mac OS. So I am recommending like taking the door off if you're going to be doing any serious gaming with this particular card. In those benchmarks, I was getting, and of course reading it in Celsius, anywhere between 70, like low 70s to like 77 Celsius in the benchmark testing, and it didn't really get up over that, and it was totally fine. I can't tell you like what it was like when the thing just stopped working, because I was trying to run those benchmarks, but everything just crashed. It like shut down, and I couldn't get any history on that using iStat. So I don't know what it actually got up to, but obviously hot enough for it to cut off. Now let's actually talk about the video editing aspects and comparing Final Cut Pro with Davinci Resolve. And I was really surprised at, Final Cut Pro being that it's native to Mac OS, like that's Apple's program, and how it actually uses a CPU versus a graphics card, and actually how Davinci Resolve in some cases seems to be a bit more efficient. But I don't want to get into a Davinci Resolve versus Final Cut Pro, but I just find it interesting. However, the eGPU was definitely very beneficial in a lot of these tests. And I also want to let you know that I use the same clips in each of the programs, but I created different project timelines because I didn't want to go in and use the Iris graphics card first, the integrated graphics card, and then have like color correction and LUTs and things like all that cached, even if like I undid it. I wanted to have fresh project timelines for each one. So just wanted to preface there. So starting with a fairly large timeline, it was a 12-minute timeline that what I ended up doing, everything was color corrected But what I went ahead and did is I added an adjustment layer over top the whole timeline. It was a 12-minute timeline in Final Cut Pro. And then what I did was I added a LUT to that whole thing, just for the sake of sometimes I actually do that in some of my workflow. And the intensity was set at 100%. And what I got was pretty nuts. And like, this is some of the stuff that I've been dealing with a base model 13-inch MacBook Pro, was that entire adjustment layer with that LUT on it, it took about an hour and 10 minutes on the integrated graphics card versus the eGPU, which actually took me 27 minutes and 52 seconds. So that kind of time savings when you're working with small budgets, or you're thinking about your time or your deliverables and getting this work out fast, that is a huge savings. I mean, that was like more than half of a time savings on something like that. Now let's flip that over to a smaller timeline, and this is where Davinci Resolve comes in as well, because I didn't do Davinci Resolve with that 12-minute timeline, but let's talk about this one. So in Final Cut Pro, I had a 2 minute 25-second timeline, and it was color corrected, and I added a LUT just the same way with an adjustment layer at 100% intensity. And the results in Final Cut Pro on the Iris graphics card was 14 minutes and 52 seconds, where the eGPU actually got me 2 minutes and 40 seconds. So again, huge time savings here and helping me get that output and those results much quicker, those deliverables much quicker. Now, looking at Resolve, I understand that the LUTs can be a little bit different and the color correction, but everything being like equal, what I was finding was that once I did the color correction and I did the LUT, so that all came out in Davinci at 10 minutes and 34 seconds on the integrated graphics card and 2 minutes and 11 seconds on the eGPU. So again, huge savings, but it's also interesting to see natively that the MacBook Pro worked really, really well in Davinci versus Final Cut Pro. But I don't want to get into like a Davinci versus Final Cut Pro. I just wanted to highlight that this is what the output was that I was getting. Now, stabilizing clips is definitely something that is important and something that I do, and I'm talking about all of the integrated stabilization in Final Cut Pro and Davinci, so nothing customized here, no customized plugins. So working with that, the integrated Iris graphics card for a 15-second clip in Final Cut Pro was 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Versus 1 minute and 54 seconds with the eGPU. Now, here we go with Davinci Resolve and somehow it handling it a little bit differently. With the integrated graphics card, we got 3 minutes and 27 seconds. And on the eGPU, we got 32 seconds to stabilize that clip. Now again, I understand that these are two different programs and it stabilizes a little bit differently, but I just thought it was interesting that we were definitely seeing some massive difference when it came to lowering that time with stabilization and some color correction. Now flipping back over to Final Cut Pro for a second, I want to talk about a plugin and a resource, Pixel Film Studios. A lot of YouTubers and a lot of filmmakers use that because they have these titles and these plugins that are already keyframed for you. It saves you a lot of time and you can customize them as you need to. It's not full customization, so I certainly do keyframing and a lot of customization on my videos, but sometimes you just need to save a little bit of time and these plugins are great. However, they definitely use a lot of resource when it comes to the graphics performance. So what I was actually noticing with a particular Pixel Film Studios title effect, when I put that on a 2-minute timeline, the internal graphics card was taking 3 minutes and 23 seconds versus the eGPU at 34 seconds. So every time you're working with those title sequences or like those titles, those plugins, when you adjust the text or when you adjust anything with it, it has to render, and so it's almost like starting all over again, that like 3 minutes plus. So that can be very cumbersome versus waiting like 20 to 30 seconds every time like you adjust something on that title. So I like those plugins, but they use a ton of resource. Now, retiming is also something that I work in. And so for like a 15-second clip that I wanted to retime, I shot it in 120 frames per second, and I wanted to slow that down to about 50%. So to retime that, we were looking at, for the internal Iris graphics card, at 56 seconds to do that, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you compare that to the eGPU, 12 seconds is actually what it took to retime that particular clip. So I'll definitely take those savings for sure. Now, optical flow is something that I use in Final Cut Pro, and what I was getting there for the internal graphics card was 7 minutes and 1 second on that versus 4 minutes and 56 seconds on the eGPU. So not a huge savings, but certainly a savings nonetheless. Now, when we talk about rendering the video, and I'm not talking about .264, .265, we're talking about ProRes files, so much larger files here. And comparing Final Cut Pro to Davinci, this was also interesting depending on the size of the project. So in Final Cut Pro, rendering and exporting a ProRes, 2-minute ProRes project, what we were getting on the internal graphics card was 5 minutes and 56 seconds versus 4 minutes and 38 seconds on the eGPU. Not a ton of savings there either, but again, we'll take what we can get. Now, Davinci was very similar on the internal, so for Resolve, what we were looking at for the internal was 5 minutes and 19 seconds on that same ProRes for the internal, and then 3 minutes and 16 seconds on the eGPU. Now, I have to say that there was a little bit of a savings there with the eGPU because I do feel that Resolve is using the eGPU quite well. Now, I understand like Davinci Resolve and Blackmagic, like that's essentially like one and the same because they're trying to cater to the Mac OS user here. So I'm just impressed by the fact that they are utilizing that eGPU, and in some cases, quite a bit more than Final Cut Pro. Because what I was finding was that looking at iStat and looking at the CPU versus the GPU is that the eGPU was actually kicking in, but it was almost as if Final Cut Pro really wanted to use the CPU. Not to say that Davinci Resolve didn't, but compared to, let's say, 30 to 40% of the CPU uses, maybe even like 50%, in Resolve versus Final Cut Pro, there were some things when I was trying to render them or work with them, the eGPU was working, but the CPU was almost maxed out at like 90 to 90+% of the CPU. So Final Cut Pro is still using that CPU, and that's the one thing that I wanted to talk about was that if you have a base model 13-inch MacBook Pro, the eGPU is definitely going to save you quite a bit of time. I do not at this time have a 15-inch MacBook Pro to hook this thing up to, not yet, but what I will say is that having those extra cores and even a much better graphics performance, you're definitely going to just crush the MacBook Pro right out of the gates, just natively, like right out of the box with no eGPU. I do feel like the eGPU may be better suited for someone like myself that has the base model 13-inch MacBook Pro or something in that neighborhood, whereas the 15-inch MacBook Pro, using Final Cut Pro specifically or even Resolve, you may find some savings there, but it may not necessarily be enough to make that type of investment. All right, so flipping back over to the Mantiz versus the Blackmagic eGPU, like yes, that Blackmagic at $1,300 retail, like it's expensive, but it's pretty much a set it and forget it. Like you plug the thing in and it's gonna work and it's gonna power your displays and it's gonna work with Mac, no problem. But us Mac users, we're always getting dinged by the PC crowd out there saying like, well, you know, what you get is what you get, right? Whatever you order, you can't upgrade the RAM, you can't upgrade the hard drives, anything like that. So here's our opportunity to have something that's upgradable, that'll work with us. So with 2 of the 3.0 USB type A on the front and then 3 on the back, along with that Lightning Thunderbolt 3 on the back as well. And that doesn't include the graphics card that has the HDMI and 3 display ports on it. You're gonna be able to use this thing as a docking station. This is my video editing machine because I've actually been able to connect my Samsung T5 into that port in the back, and it connects just like it does if I plug it directly into the computer, and I can do all of my video editing from there. And the same thing like with gaming. If you wanted to keep your games on an external drive and not on the internal hard drive, you can actually use this as a docking station. And the bonus is that this actually has SATA 3, so you can connect an SSD in there. So if you don't want this T5 or an external hard drive at all kind of mucking up your desk, or you don't want it connected, then go ahead and put that SSD in there. And that's actually where I can be editing my videos or playing games and have everything dedicated to that. So then once I'm done, then I'm done with those files and I don't need them anymore. Then I can push those over to my server, but keep this as like a docking station purely for video editing, like in my office. Now, yeah, I can keep files on like the T5 and clone all of that data or have it on my internal hard drive and work on the road, sure, but I do a ton of video editing in my office, and so something like this is definitely the way to go. It does take up a little bit of space and the cord is quite small, but the Mantiz actually recommends just using that short cable that it comes with because you're gonna get the best performance out of it. It's totally fine for me for right now, but what I will say for those MacBook Pro users that are at the 13-inch base model or somewhere in that range, I do think that this is a great investment, and I do think it is a better investment than the Blackmagic eGPU, especially because you can upgrade it. This was a long video, folks. I do appreciate you sticking with me. I just wanted to answer as many questions as I possibly could and get as much information out there. I'm going to continue to put this thing through the paces, so if you have any questions or comments, I will try to answer them the best that I can. I will send those resources within the description below and within the video as far as other YouTubers and other experts out there when it comes to the card, the Mantiz, the Mac, gaming on it, doing some video editing so that you can also get more of your questions answered. Appreciate you hanging with me for this long. As always, go out there and do things that matter. Go rock faces. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe and like because I'm going to be doing a lot more stuff that's probably less involved, but more tech on this channel. So stay tuned for that, and we'll catch you on the next one.